Greetings as we come now to the sixth Sunday of the Easter time, of the Easter season. The readings for this time, the first reading comes from the book of Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10. Now, there are edited verses, so the verses that we will hear are 25 through 26, 34 through 35, 44 through 48. The second reading comes from the letter of John again, this time chapter 4, verses 7 through 10. And the gospel once again is from John, this time chapter 15, verses 9 through 17. So I thought we would start this time by looking at the account from Acts. Now, it's edited for various reasons, perhaps simply because of its length, but I would like to kind of spend a little bit of time analyzing this particular section in the story of the Acts of the Apostles. As we have noted, this book is used as the first reading throughout the Easter time, and it is edited according to certain ways. Sometimes when it matches the gospel reading, as selections have been done for other times of the year, but not necessarily. The story of the Acts, which you remember is the companion piece to the story of Jesus by the third gospel writer, tells the story that the Christian community develops, first of all, in the city of Jerusalem. And the opening 8 chapters of this particular work picture all of the activities that take place among the early Christians in Jerusalem. Then, with the stoning of Stephen, there is the story of the beginning to spread. That is, some of the apostles or disciples stay in the city of Jerusalem, but some of the others leave and spread throughout other districts, particularly in the Palestinian area. Now, the point that is carefully noted here is that the message that is being brought about Jesus raised is brought to fellow Hebrews. How does a different scenario develop? And this is what chapter 10 is really all about. It's about the story of how the Jewish experience of Jesus as the Messiah shares this message with those who are not Jewish. Now, the story begins, and put into perspective, because this is one of the longest stories developed in the Acts of the Apostles. It develops with a picture of Peter being in the city of Jaffa. Jaffa is a seaport town on the Mediterranean. Reasons are not quite clear why he is there, but he is there, staying at the home of a tanner. And one day, Peter goes up on the roof I'm not sure what he's doing up there, but he has a vision as he's up there, and this great net opens up before him, and a variety of animals of all kind are pictured. And the invitation is given. This, of course, is a vision now from the Lord. Take and eat. And Peter says, no, there are certain animals I won't touch because they are unclean. Well, the vision backs off, comes back again, says the same thing, does it a third time, as good stories go, a third time. And the word is that God is reminding Peter that he has created all, that God has created all creatures, and that this distinction of clean and unclean is one that the ritualness of Judaism has developed, but is not really so necessary. It's at this point that Peter gets a knock on the door. Now, apparently he comes downstairs, and there is a messenger from a centurion in Caesarea named Cornelius, who is asking Peter to come to Caesarea. Now, the Romans, just a little bit of background here, had built the city of Caesarea Maritima, as it was known, the Caesar city on the sea, and had done really a marvelous job of expanding a little bit of the territory out into the sea. Had actually built up harbors and, well, not harbors, but ways in which ships could kind of anchor and things like that. And Caesarea had become the administrative capital of the Roman provisional government, and it was also there that later on King Agrippa, when Paul would be brought there, had dealt with him. So we know a little bit about this particular place, and in fact archaeologists today, by the way, this whole city has sunk under the waters. It is one of the only what we would call underwater archaeological sites, because nature over the centuries retook what had been done by the Romans in the first century of expanding outward. Now unable to continue that, it had been abandoned after a couple of centuries, and the waters had taken over. So all of that is an archaeological dig, as they say, but much of it is being done because you have to go underwater to discover what was there. But this city had all of the trappings of a Roman city, a great arena, horse races were done there, all kinds of activity. Certainly put this particular city on the map of the first century time. Now, what we also know archaeologically, just as an aside, they have found a stone that if you visit there today, you can find it, a stone on which is inscribed the name of Pontius Pilate. And of course, that's very interesting because we know his role in the story of Jesus indicates that he was there and that this was his headquarters. And we know that this is where he stayed most of the time, going up to Jerusalem only for the 3 major holidays or feasts of the Jewish community in order to maintain order. And it was during that time, of course, that he was in Passover time, was in Jerusalem when Jesus was arrested and crucified. So all of that is background. Now, what had happened in the home of a Roman centurion named Cornelius is that he had come to accept, he and his household, which would include not only his family but his servants, or, quote, slaves, had come to embrace the message of Jesus, which is interesting. So this story is told. Now, Peter is told, here's back up where we were a moment, is asked by these servants of Cornelius to come to Maritima, and that's what he does. And when he comes there, he finds that Cornelius and his household have accepted Jesus. Now, what is important here is that, of course, he is not only a Roman soldier, but he is also certainly not one liked by the Jewish community of the time. Now, in looking at Cornelius, there is a certain parallelism here. We notice how Cornelius is pictured as a God-fearing man. God-fearers is a technical term. I think we've mentioned this before that Luke likes to use. A God-fearer is someone who was interested in Judaism but had not made the step yet to become a Jew. So this group of God-fearers were believers, we believe in one God, but not yet embracing the tradition and patterns of Israel. So Peter now comes to the home of Cornelius. There is a certain likeness here. Cornelius is liked by the Jewish community, or at least by the members of the Jewish community who were living somewhat in Caesarea Maritima. The parallelism here is to the centurion in Luke's Gospel in chapter 7, who you remember comes to see Jesus because his servant is ill and would like Jesus to come down and to heal him. And the folks with the centurion say, he's a good guy because he likes us, he's been nice to the Jewish community. So there is, which is typical of Lucan thought, a parallelism between the unnamed centurion in the gospel and now the named centurion here in the Acts. While Peter is therefore in the home of and the house of Cornelius, the Spirit comes. There is the coming of the Holy Spirit, which is interesting. Remember that the Holy Spirit, and this we will celebrate in a couple weeks at Pentecost, is the descent of the Spirit, which was found in chapter 2 of the Acts. But here now, the Spirit comes upon the household of Cornelius. And Peter says, well, if this is the work of the Spirit to welcome into the family of faith outsiders, these Gentiles, then who are we to stand against receiving them? This doesn't set well with all of the Christians of Jewish background who accept Jesus. And so when he comes up to Jerusalem, Peter tells the story again of what happened, how he had this vision, how he had this call to come to the home of Cornelius, how he embraced them there, how even he had spent time with them. And that's interesting, meaning probably in the traditional Lucan way, had dined with them, had eaten with them. And this is a breakthrough moment in the story of Christianity. Now, it doesn't necessarily automatically, and we got to be careful to make this conclusion, but it does mean, and the story is told, Peter, of course, recognized as one of the leaders of the early Christian community, tells the community at Jerusalem what has happened and realizes, as the phrase is used here, that God shows no partiality, that God has indeed invited all into the family of Jesus. So, why should there be a total acceptance of the Gentiles? Well, one is the story of the outpouring of the Spirit upon them. Secondly, is the recognition of this phenomena by the church, by the gathered community, and Peter now extends this story so that the community at Jerusalem might feel comfortable and aware of what is happening. So I go into all this because although later on Paul is going to be considered to be the apostle to the Gentiles, it is interesting here that the first to recognize and accept non-Jews into the Christian family turns out to be Peter. Now, there is still this kind of unique relationship between Judaism and those who accept Jesus as the Messiah, and it will take chapter 15 of Acts to kind of reconcile just how much of the tradition of Judaism needs to be followed by those who embrace Jesus as the Messiah and how much is not necessary. So we've expanded on this a little bit so that you have some background as to why this is brought to our attention this week. The non-Israelites are not circumcised, and that's why they were considered not pleasing to God. Peter, in his kind of approach here, says because what the role of the Spirit is done, they are acceptable and should become members with us of the Christian family. So that's a little bit of a background. As I say, can read further where in chapter 15 this issue again breaks out because Paul has been bringing the good news of Jesus to Gentiles without asking them to accept Jewish ways, particularly without accepting circumcision. You can read in chapter 15 how that it works out. In typical Lucan manner, the major components of different positions meet in Jerusalem and arrive at an equitable solution. Paul himself, in his letter to the Galatians, if you read this, has a little different approach. He doesn't see that he needs their approval for what he's doing, but again, perhaps important to see that the connection between Peter and Paul here and the admission of non-Jews to the Christian family is something that ultimately or intimately they both approved of. All right, so study a little bit of that from this particular section of the Acts of the Apostles. Now, the gospel reading that we hear this time is really a continuance of the verses that we heard last time. Remember that last time it's the analogy of the vine and the branches, that Jesus is the vine and those who believe in him are the branches. Now, this time, the words chosen are those which have to do with the commandments. Namely, you need to love your neighbor. We need to love one another. We need to keep the great commandment of love. Now, I suppose there's many descriptions and discussions about the term love. In fact, in these 8 verses that we hear, the term is used 8 times. So that perhaps is a little reason to pause a moment here. In the Mediterranean world, certainly in which the gospel was written, and affected somewhat by what we would know as the Hellenistic culture, and keep in mind that John's gospel is certainly written during the time in which the Greco-Roman world was kind of the predominant thought pattern that kind of colored the Mediterranean world, does not think of love essentially as affective love, as a kind of personal feeling kind of thing, which is often the way, is that not, in which we think of love. But love here equals an attachment or a bonding, particularly to a group. And that's why, for example, a man is given in another section of the gospel, when he marries, is to leave father and mother and to reapproach or rededicate his love to his spouse. Doesn't mean that he separates himself from his family and his group, but it does mean so there's not a disattachment from his house, but rather he is to cleave to his wife. This, of course, is often used at marriage ceremonies and that, so that's why I do that. But Jesus here in this section questions the claim that God is their Father. So he is pictured as saying to to the fellow Hebrews, and we keep coming back to this discussion about who are the Jews that the gospel is addressing, that it is clear, and this is the section or the point that's trying to be made, that those who cling to Jesus, okay, there's the vine and branch story again, truly reflect the love that God has for them and that they should have for one another. In other words, love here might be connected with qualities of courageousness, heroicness, an honorable death. And this would be, by the way, these would be Mediterranean virtues. So one, when one sees it, should have love for one another, love for one's nation, and even for the Romans, love for the gods and goddesses. So when Jesus here argues that love is, well, how shall we place this? Talk about this a little bit. Friendship, okay? Now, keep in mind that the Johannine Gospel is well aware of the Hellenistic culture and is not really dealing with it explicitly, but certainly it underpins the way in which the Johannine Gospel presents its message. There were different kinds of friendship. So love here equals friendship in antiquity. Sometimes friendship was a relationship of dependence or of equality. So in other words, you love those who are of the same social group as you or the same cultural background as you. We have noticed this before, that often there was, in order to get ahead, political dependence on a royal patron. So true friends of a ruler ought to have the freedom to speak freely, and so therefore the thought was that this kind of love friendship allowed one to give the truth and not simply, to engage in flattery. Well, and there's a lot of discussion about this. Love, therefore, indicated a companionship based on groups, sometimes of the same sex, sometimes of the same age. Sometimes it constituted political parties. So what I'm kind of suggesting here is that this idea of love, friendship, is much more layered than at first glance it might seem. In fact, the Epicureans, who are a movement, by the way, in Hellenic society, and they also emphasized friendship, and they regarded friendship or love as a source of pleasure. And that, of course, is why some later writers in the Christian tradition were not so impressed by the Epicureans. Epicureans was a philosophic group. Now, I mention this because keep in mind that the gospel is written into the Mediterranean culture, which expanded the whole around the Mediterranean Sea, and in some ways into parts of Palestine in the eastern, from their point of view, section, but nevertheless was pretty much recognized by all. So friendship equals equality equals love. The Hellenistic idea, therefore, of love placed great strength on loyalty. Now, why do I mention all this? Because Jesus says, greater love than this no one has, than one lays down his life for his friends. And I will lay down my life for my friends. So get all of this. Love, friendship is at work here in this little section of Well, not only of this part of the gospel, but throughout much of the gospel. There is, and we've mentioned this and noticed this before in the Johannine tradition, how often there is a kind of repetition of understandings and ideas. So, from the Hellenistic ideals, loyalty is very important. Perhaps going back to a story between David and Jonathan, in which there was loyalty. One really knows one's friends when one's loyalty is tested. So, friends are the recipients of one's confidence and intimacy. Friends are not, therefore, servants or slaves. And so hear the words that Jesus says here now. I do not call you slaves, but I call you friends, because the slave does not know what his master is thinking. Now, all of this, of course, Jesus laying down his life. We have seen this imagery before. Once again, that's part of this particular section of the gospel that we're looking at. And if indeed, by loyalty and friendship to Jesus, he shows this to the disciples, they in turn are being, invited, perhaps warned a little, that true friendship would require a reciprocity, that what Jesus does for them, what Jesus does for us, we should be willing to, says John, to the disciples, or pictures Jesus as saying, also do for one another. So what does love one another mean? See, so it entails all of the richness here that we have been suggesting. In the divine household, which is the household of God, the sign of love is the readiness to give one's own life for the beloved. So therefore, friendships and household relationships overlap. A man's friends are part of his whole loving situation. Jesus keeps his Father's command. So what is he doing? He is bringing honor. He is bringing loyalty to the Father. And as Jesus does this, because the Father and he are one, so those who accept, that is, the disciples, are encouraged to do the same. So I know a lot of this kind of moves around in a circle, and that's a little bit the way in which this whole section of John's Gospel is connected. So keep in mind the loyalty that the vine and the branches, I bring that in because this is really a commentary on the words that we heard last time. And that kind of friendship, that kind of loyalty, that kind of dedication, that kind of ongoing relationship, and this gospel, as we've noticed so often, is about relationships. The relationship of love, the relationship of devotion, the relationship of fidelity is what Jesus is willing to show to his disciples, and therefore is willing to, as it were, lay down his life. May his disciples also be willing to do the same. This would be something that a Mediterranean culture, as I mentioned, would have appreciated. The loyalty of Jesus to the Father, to the nation, well, that of course is not much discussed here, but to Israel and to his friends is what this is really all about. To lay down one's life for and behalf of shows the loyalty and honor. When we do this, says Jesus, who does it for his disciples, we do it for the Father. Thank you for being with us. Just in conclusion, this coming week will be the Feast of the Ascension of Jesus, and the Gospel will be from Mark 16, verses 15 through 20. I just mentioned this. We have talked about that in other times, but just that you might be aware of that. Again, hope to see you again next time. Have a good day.